Yes, it is.
As in for science and her home.
That explains a lot. All righty, I held us late last week. We're going to not do that today. That's been bothering me all week. I'm probably the only one that's cared. But you were? Two others. Nope. All right. As a reminder, if you haven't been here yet, if you have a question, text @InMacMusic to the number 81010. If you've already done it, you don't need to do it again. That's going to start a new chat, a new thread, text message thread on your phone and your device, and then you can just text away. That's going to bring whatever questions you may have straight to my cell phone. I'm not going to know your name, so if you need me to know your name, you need to include that in your text. Hopefully I can get the questions answered for you. Today's class is all about the social status of musicians. Isn't that exciting? We're going to, there's a kind of a question here. Before I begin, I've got to make a couple of things very clear. When I'm talking in for the week 1, week 2, and then today, week 3, this is all one unit. This is the end of unit 1, which is approaching the history of music in the church from a secular point of view. Right? So when I say the word Christian, I'm talking about worldly Christian. I'm talking about, when we're talking about the medieval Christian, really what we're talking about is a Catholic, Roman Catholic entity, or things that are broken off that recognize Christ as deity, things like the Church of England. Okay? It's not necessarily specifically focused to those who only follow Scripture. That's really important to understand because that is a sacred point of view. We're not doing that for weeks 1, 2, and 3. We're looking at a much, much broader picture. So that's going to come into play substantially this week in particular. So when I keep saying in the Christian church and the Christian tradition, I am speaking from a secular, global perspective. Okay. The second is we're going to be talking about today's is the social status. We're going to touch on things from week 1, week 2, but when we talk about social status, we're not necessarily talking about the practice of music. Okay, put it this way: if you think about your favorite artist, your musical artist, and if they were to walk into this room right now, you might be like, "Wow, there is so and so." And that's pretty cool, right? And you respect them for their work. But as a person, they're just another person, right? You take somebody else who might be, say, in the band behind the scenes, not necessarily the person who's on stage, but the person who is supporting them, whether that's a guitar or a drummer. Who knows their favorite drummer, right? That person on stage to that crowd in that moment is exciting. You take that same person and you put them in the supermarket, nobody knows who they are because their social status is a little bit different depending on context, right? I have two examples that I want to go through before we really get into this to solidify what I'm talking about with social status. The first is recently in New York, there is a violinist who played in the subway. This has been around social media now for about 2 or 3 years, if I had to guess, maybe longer. Where a violinist was playing in the subway, very few people paid attention to them, and maybe tossed a couple of dollars here and there. It was enjoyable. Maybe one person who appreciates it applaud, but largely this person went ignored. Later that night, they performed at Carnegie Hall as a featured soloist. World famous artist, musician. Out of context, doesn't matter, right? It's a little bit about status. All of us, here's your other example, all of us have a bottle of water from time to time. That bottle of water in the supermarket might be a couple of dollars. You take that same bottle of water and you put it in, say, like maybe the Thunder concession stand, and all of a sudden it's a little bit more than a couple of dollars. Right? It's all about status and where you are. Context matters. And so our perspective today matters. We're going to start briefly here with a summary of weeks 1 and 2. This is what we talked about the last 2 weeks to get everyone caught up. Archaeological record shows that music has been in every culture discovered to date. The first century Greco-Roman Empire shows that instrumental music was not just part of daily life, it was thriving. It was integrated in education and in their religious ritual, albeit pagan. It was also common to see it out in the streets. It was everywhere. They had access to instrumental music. The Jewish musical practice at the same time had instruments in the temple only. The synagogues in the surrounding areas were exclusively vocal. I had an interesting question about last week. There was kind of like that almost sense of disbelief. Are you what? 300-400 years? Nothing? I did my homework. Confirmed. Exclusively vocal. In the synagogues. And instruments were only in the temple by only the Levites of only a certain age and of only a certain family line. If you want to get closer, okay. The leaders, I think that's up there. Only the leaders could be of one of three. Yeah, one of three lines. You could, as a musician, you just had to be a Levite. But if you wanted to be, say, like the choir director, you had to be of a specific genealogy. Okay. No record from any culture shows instrumental music in Christian worship for at least the first 3 centuries. That's highly debated, but I put that up there because that comes from somebody who wrote something in like 10-something, I think. 670, 666, remember that from the organ? That's the first recorded instance of an organ being in a religious building. It wasn't actually used in service, though. So it's going to be closer to 800. If we could target it, it would be 811. It wasn't really accepted until after 1100. That last sentence is the key for the first 2 weeks. Despite overwhelming access and cultural norm for instrumental music, the early Christian church absorbed none of it. Interesting. Okay, social status time. We're going to go all the way back again like we did in the first 2 weeks. Remember, we're going to go all the way back to ancient cultures and move our way forward from different perspectives, right? Week 1 from archaeology. Week 2 from sacred writings, early writings, right? Week 3, social status. This picture over here is from Mesopotamia. I'm going to point something out here in just a moment. You can read the screen maybe, if I get out of the way maybe, huh? Okay. You had a social standing if you were a royal musician or if you had some sort of sacred duty. How do we know? So not everyone's an archaeologist, right? But it kind of stands to reason that records in, say, things like the temple are probably going to be better preserved than things in like just a common hut, right? So when we say things like, when we make claims like this, we can only base them on the things that we have found in the archaeological written record, which are the things that have survived. Okay? So we may be putting an overemphasis on this, but there's also a lot of evidence to support. Okay? I'm not going to go into all of that evidence right now. If you're really interested, it's my master's thesis. It's at UCO. You're welcome to read that if you're bored out of your mind. Okay? This is a picture from Ur. They call it circa 2500 BC. There is a lyre player in the middle of this. I want you to take a look at the very front of that lyre. Right here, what do you see? What animal? It kind of looks like a goat. Kind of looks like it's a bull. Okay, it's a bull. Anyone know what a bull might symbolize in ancient Ur? Yeah. A god. It's deity. Why in the world would you be playing that for someone who is seated, holding a cup next to them. Do you see how we can infer this a little bit? It's a temple musician, someone playing for probably some sort of royalty of some kind. If we were to zoom this out, it'll be a lot easier to understand what that is. But I really want you to look at this, okay? That right there. Okay, because here it is. This is made out of bronze, inlaid with shells for the eyes, and lapis lazuli, gemstones. Expensive gemstones. Okay? Think about if you were to break open a geode, you know, the like purpley, bluish kind of crystals inside rocks, whatnot. That's kind of what it might look like. Okay? Really tiny, small pieces in here. In fact, I don't see any on this particular piece at the moment. But that's what it is. Courtesy of the Met in New York City. Cool. This tablet, cuneiform, lists 23 musical instruments, and they're specifically in the context of royal and religious services. So again, archaeological records that are preserved are going to be from things like their temples, their religious centers, their royal courts, right? So naturally, we're going to have the records that say instruments were used here because that's what's going to be preserved, right? Makes perfect sense. Why would you take the time to write it down if it wasn't important? Okay, so I want you to see here that yes, this is true, but that musicians existed in the royal courts. Yes, they existed in religious practices. It was clear that we have musical instruments and a lot of them that are being used in these places, but that's not necessarily exclusively where they were because we don't have the complete archaeological record. Okay, for those of you who have never taken a science class before, we cannot use the word prove, right? This suggests that we have a strong instrumental presence in these places. We don't know what daily life was like for the commoner. But it's interesting that it's preserved in this way, that it was preserved in the written record. That's pretty important. Okay, that's ancient Mesopotamia in a nutshell. Okay, Egypt. We're all familiar with ancient Egypt, I think, right? Pyramids and whatnot. Take a guess. How often does music appear in the written record of ancient Egypt? Talk about percentages. What do you think? 70 or 7? 70. Okay.
71.
Uh-oh. Come on down. You're the next contestant. No other guesses? Does that sound high? Pretty low, actually. Pretty low. Egyptian written records have music or a musical instrument referenced about 94% of the time. Okay? Of the written record. I'm not talking about like everything that's on there, right? But as far as a document is concerned, you're going to find some sort of instrument or a reference to some sort of musical ritual or some sort of something that has to do with music almost everywhere in Egypt. It was very common. Temple musicians, shemayat. I can't pronounce it, so good luck. Okay. Courtly rituals. These are things like feasts, banquets, buffets. Okay. Not always having to do with food, but they were around. These musicians had special roles. We know that because they're painted and depicted very differently in the archaeological record. They have much more elegant clothing. Their instruments themselves are ordained a little bit better than common instruments. Priest musicians played instruments, and they had high standing. There's some indication as to why and how. Now, this next paragraph is very interesting. This is one of the few things that sets Egypt apart from most other ancient cultures. Okay, women could be musicians in the temple. Beres-Semun was an actual musician. She was a vocalist, and she was mummified and laid to rest in a tomb with Pharaoh. Only one to have been discovered, to my knowledge, who has done that. But her sarcophagus listed her as the, I can't remember if it's the temple or the priestess, one of them, the vocalist. Chantress of Amun, A-M-U-N, is another one that was identified and labeled. Unusual religious authority, of course. And females trained to play instruments. Okay, this takes a little. This needs a little bit of time to be treated properly. Okay, I'm saying females in there because it's not just women and not just girls, but girls were learning musical instruments as part of their education. Almost liken it to maybe some movies that we have seen, Pride and Prejudice, 2001, 2005, 2001, 5, is one of them, where we have the female characters that are playing the piano throughout the movie, right? It was almost expected that they knew how to play, right? Well, same thing. It was taught. It was part of their education. Boys didn't do that. Boys did other things, okay? As part of their education. Later on, they played instruments. They played different instruments. There's a clear gender difference between a male instrument and a female instrument when it comes time to decipher religious practice. Okay, narrow that down. Okay, if you are training up your girls musically as part of their education, and you're in ancient Egypt, which is run by gods and goddesses, where do you think they're going to play? Right? Okay? They're going to grow up to become musicians in the temple. They're going to have special places, and in fact, we have that depiction just right here. Okay? We don't see women playing instruments outside of the temple, though. When I say temple, what I'm really talking about is their religious centers. Okay. Okay. The temple means something specific, so that's not what it is. Okay. Last line there. Outside of the temple, musicians existed, but were not well regarded. It's a common theme throughout history. Why were they not well regarded, or the lower class? Because they were itinerant. They were transient. They moved from place to place. If you had a religious center to play at, then you stayed there. Because you stayed there, you were part of the society and culture of that location, and people became to come to know you. And you were able to see that maybe you were not just a bottle of water on the shelf, or it's just some random musician in the subway. You had a place. Sir? That comes a lot later. But I mean, gypsies meaning like just moving around from place to place, making a buck, kind of thing. Yeah, they existed that way, sure. That we see that all throughout time, for sure. Okay, not all musicians were women. This is a musician not as elegantly dressed. Yeah, this is what I'm talking about how do we know if this particular musician was a court musician or a temple musician or a street musician? Okay, one, because he's playing a harp. That's a whole different ballgame. Harps were not as well regarded as other instruments like the lyre or the trumpet. And so you have that's one way. The other is that he is kneeling; they are not. Okay. These are a lot of other things that we use to determine social status. Curious to know what a trumpet looked like? A biblical trumpet? There it is. That is a very real trumpet from ancient Egypt, dating from the time period of Moses. I don't think I have the date up there. I don't. So if you were to harmonize the dates of what do you call the Common Era, before the Common Era versus the other, right? This is what it looked like. Kind of about what you might expect. No valves. Or before that, right? Allegedly, this instrument can perform in the harmonic series if you're interested in understand what that means. Pretty long. longer than you might expect, right? You might see these kind of things in like the medieval cartoons, like the Disney Robin Hood, where the trumpets come up and the banners hang down and doo-doo, doo-doo-doo, doo-doo, right? We don't know exactly what they played, but there it is. But look at that second line there. Why would trumpets be primarily played by men when they're often found in the royal tombs with religious artifacts, which you would normally have women performing at? Take a guess. Hard to handle? Yeah, I mean, that's bronze, right? So, I mean, that's going to be heavy. What? There it is. A lot of hot air. A lot of hot air. I'm just going to let that one rest. Because there was a military tradition. Okay? Trumpets came from the military, and they were added into religious service later. All right, moving forward, ancient Greece. We're familiar with this more than other cultures, so I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on this. In ancient Greece, civic cults, the cult of Apollo, followers of Dionysus, so to speak, that was the lyre and the aulos, respectively. They were very well respected. This is like that, your favorite musician walking through the door, you knew who they were. And they were well known. Pythian Games was a music contest and performed fairly often. Professional performers, and I mean like those that are not involved in religious service. Okay, your professional musicians were not well regarded. Okay, this is that bottle of water example. Alrighty, this is that if you're at a Thunder game, you're going to be worth this. If you're on the shelf and you're not cold, still in the package, you know, one of those little 8-ounce jobs, right? You're here. You're still a bottle of water. You have value to someone who sees you with value, but to someone in the general context of the economic standing of the age, not so much. Okay, you were there to perform. You weren't there as a critical member of society. Plato even disapproved of professional musicianships because of the moral effect. That's about all I'll say about that part. Okay. Outside of cults, musicians were often not here. They walked around all over the place. Why? Well, because if you were here, you needed to find a job and you needed to make $1. Once you played your concert set, everyone heard you. So time to go, right? Got to find somewhere else to go. You got to go and play. Okay. Kithara, we already talked about that. The instrument of 11 strings, sometimes referred to. I think it's Psalm 33 references that, but there it is, about 490 BC. This next slide here shows the aulos in 2 locations. We have the aulos being played for a banquet. You can see almost this is a social status type of thing where you have the aulos player playing for this guy who's reclining. He's at a banquet. He's chillaxing, right? Having a great time. Entertainer. But that's all they were. I'm done. Thank you, goodbye, right? We have business to attend to. We have politics to discuss. Okay? These are not such things that musicians deal with. Okay? The aulos player on the oil flask. This is important. What do you know about oil lamps and oil flasks? Other than that, they contain oil. You had your name on them. It was like, you had like a possessiveness to it, right? It was like that was your source of light at night, right? That was your source of sometimes maybe even heat or cooking, okay? Whose name is on the flask? It's not going to be the master of the house. It's going to be the person who is going to use it, okay? We have the aulos player has the same kind of standing as a common household slave. Okay? And on an oil flask. That's very, very telling. Put those two together. And there you go. Okay. Jewish practice. We're in the Old Testament all the way up to the Second Temple. We've already gone over some of this, but for the sake of beating a dead horse, musicians in the temple were Levites. You didn't have any random players in there. You had to be a Levite, right? And you had specific duties. Because of that, because of the religious duties, you had influence, but not because of your role as a musician, because you were ordained as a priest. Okay? You were a priest first, and then you were a musician. You were helping the sons of Aaron, and then you were a musician. Okay? That is where their status comes from. However, outside of that, they didn't really have a whole lot of authority. Within Judaism, they did. They had a lot of authority and status, but not outside. So when the temple was destroyed, AD 70, we went over this last week. When the temple was destroyed, there was no Levites to be at the temple, which didn't exist, so their job went away, which means no more musicians. But what are you going to do when you have all of these Levites? Remember, David appointed 4,000 of them, right? 3 family lines just to lead. That's a lot. We have a diaspora, all these musicians coming out. What are you going to do? Well, they're still going to lead. They're still going to sing. They're still going to participate in music. They have songs, psalms to go through. We have what they become as cantors, or there's the Hebrew. Okay? And they did continue to provide musical services for religious purposes at synagogues, but they never picked up another instrument. They were done. Interesting, I think. Why were they done? Because no temple. Their authorization was at the temple. Doesn't exist.
So does it become like choir masters, like leading that kind
Exactly. Yep. Okay. How do we know? Anyone been to Rome? Have you? Rome? In Italy? Okay. Been to Rome. I mean, you gotta, everyone been to Paris? Yeah, about 3 hours south. Okay. Rome, 81 AD, the Arch of Titus. Stands in front of the Colosseum still to this day. It was constructed there by an emperor Vespasian to honor his son, who was the one who destroyed the temple in AD 70. Although his record says AD 71 because Titus took a little bit of time to get home, so they wanted to move the timeline back a little bit to make it look like they just finished. Interesting. Okay, so it depends on what you want to go with. 80, 70, 80, 71, doesn't matter. 10 or 11 years later, this arch is complete. I don't know if you can see this up here or not. This is a relief on the arch right here. Do you see what this is? It is a menorah, right? Why would a menorah, and these are Roman soldiers, if you can't tell, okay, carrying spoils of war back to, why would they be carrying a menorah? They carried it out of the temple. Why are they carrying it out of the temple? They destroyed it. What do they care about a menorah? It's made of gold. But more than that, why are they making an arch? They were victorious. They're shoving it in their face, right? Do you know who funded the Roman aqueducts? The temple did. Exactly. Okay? These guys were taking spoils of war from the Jews, Christians, turning them around to fund the very things that suggest and promote Roman superiority. It was an insult. It was a huge insult. And it's so much so that we're going to put this huge on this arch that's leading right into the middle of the city. Okay? If you're familiar with a movie that came out a while back, the Gladiator, we have the Emperor Commodus coming back into Rome, and even the senators are kind of mocking it. He enters like he's victorious, or a conqueror, but what has he conquered? Well, this procession was normal for people like Titus and Vespasian, who went and actually did things, and then they come back to their home city, Rome, the capital, the glory of the empire. And they put on these huge processions so they could show the world how great we are. Pray tell, why are they carrying trumpets? These aren't just any trumpets. These are Jewish trumpets. You can't tell the difference in this picture. They're carrying them because it's added insult to injury, right? What's the important part then of the Jewish temple? The Romans felt it so important that we're going to take the symbols of the Jews and put them on our victorious architecture. And the two things that they picked was the menorah and the trumpets. How important then were those two things to temple worship to the Jews? It's pretty easy to make that connection, right? Pretty big deal. And it's obviously known. So there is really close. Like it was around. It was here. It was destroyed. But yet it didn't last. Instrumental music, that is, for the Jewish tradition. They didn't get mad. They didn't get upset. They didn't want their tradition back. They just said, no temple. It wasn't about the trumpet. It wasn't about the musical instrument. It was about the temple. The temple's gone. We can still praise God. Whew. If there's no other moment in history other than this that is more powerful, secularly speaking, I don't know what that is. Because that is a complete and total destruction of your religious center, and they continued on with it stronger than most other religions did in the history of the world. That's pretty cool. Okay. Levites. Tacitus and Josephus record huge disdain from the Romans against the Jews. Duh. They destroyed their temple, right? Okay. Greek and Roman societies, they valued their own musicians, but they did not value the musicians of other countries, and not just the Jews. That was any one of them. Again, Roman superiority, right? We are the best. No one else is. We're not going to recognize anyone else, okay? So, if you were a Levite and your temple just got destroyed, not only could you no longer play music as a Levite because you didn't have a temple to go to anymore, you also could not integrate into society because your job was not respected. Okay? Your job was tied to your religious practice, whereas your same job outside of your Jewish culture was tied to what you did. You could go to another religious center and perform, but you couldn't do that as a Levite. You didn't have the authority to do that, okay? So what do? Nothing, okay? Not for instrumental music anyway. In the same time, we have Christians that are coming up, Christians who are formerly Jews, Christians who are formerly Gentiles. That adds a whole nother layer of complexity when we're talking about singing, right? Okay. Early Christians who converted out of Judaism couldn't inherit their former life. I was a Jewish temple musician. No one cares, right? Your job doesn't exist anymore. Okay. The instrumental music that did exist at the time, so closely associated with Apollo and Dionysus and other gods and goddesses that you didn't want to get involved with it. And then outside of the whole religious context, other musicians that existed were lower class. Instrumental music existed only in certain places. It was thriving. It was everywhere, except It had some of these dark, intertwined little rules that existed that really messed with the social standing of people. Okay? This last sentence is kind of the transition. That's where we are coming out of the first century. And now we're going to move forward into the medieval time period. We're going to go through a couple of slides into that. But this is right here. Once we have musicians as a profession come up through royal lines, come up through sacred lines, and they cross together, that is when our musician friends become legitimate here. All right. First through the third century. Instruments themselves were suspect. They were sus. The instruments themselves. Remember in week 1 when I mentioned that God, in ancient Greece that they believed that music was, you could control nature with music, right? It was practiced by the gods and the demigods of the age, right? That's still around. That's still a thing in this time period. And so the instruments themselves were thought to be instruments of controlling nature. You didn't want to do that. God is in control, right? So the instruments themselves were still viewed as like, that's witchcraft. I don't know about this, okay? And so that had a direct reflection on the social standing of the person. Imagine walking down and you see somebody in a dark alley with a cauldron and in a big pointy hat and some smoke coming out of it, right? If it's not Halloween, we might have some questions, right? We're suspicious of it. That's what I'm talking about. Professional musicians were entertainers. They did not have a role religiously. They performed to make $1, okay? And they did what they could to make $1. Anything to make $1. Early church leaders, a couple of them listed there, they wrote extensively on this topic. They rejected instrumental music, mostly because it was associated with worldliness and immorality. There's a lot of spiritual things in there too. We'll get to that in the coming weeks. Plato and Aristotle did not like professional musicians. They wanted music integrated in education, but they wanted it for the sake of discipline, for the sake of study, for the sake of emotional development, for the sake of mental health. Music was what you do in your spare time for your enjoyment. It is not what you do as a profession. Even the Romans mocked professional musicians. They mocked their own, okay? So what does that tell you about social standing? Okay, 300 years. Late antiquity, we're in the 4th to the 6th centuries when Christianity became legalized from Constantine. We now have musicians employed again, okay? Constantine brings musicians back, but look what he does. They're cantors. They're singers. They're vocalists. Okay? And they were recorded as having social status. How do we know that? Because the record shows them in the same register and census as people like royalty, royal servants, if you will, above slaves. Still didn't play in the church service, though. They were excluded from the liturgy. That is, they were not allowed to be performed. Remember when I said at the beginning of the class, when I'm talking about the Christian worship service, I'm not talking about like ours, what we do on Sunday mornings. I'm talking about from a global perspective, right? The Catholic liturgy is starting to form pretty well here, right? There is a mass that is forming. Instruments were allowed to be before or after, but not during. Okay, so at the very beginning when I said that instruments were absent from Christian worship for the first 300 years at least, this is what I'm talking about. This is the strongest evidence to show that instruments may have been included in there. It just wasn't. Okay, there's a lot of sources there. Clement of Alexandria, John Chrysostom, Augustine, the Apostolic Constitution. They are very clear. It was vocal only. It was there. Musicians started to have some status, but as psalmists, as cantors. We get into the 7th to the 10th century. Now we have jongleurs coming through. These guys were the classic, you have like the jokers with the little bells coming off on them, the little card tricks, right? obviously hyperbole, but that's kind of the image that I want you to get, okay? These guys were the ones that were going around, they were making a dollar however they could make it. They were fraudsters. They were selling snake oil, and you were liking it, okay? These are the guys who are the stand-up comedians of their age, acrobats. I did it again. Okay. There it is. Next to them, minstrels. These were professional musicians. They were patronized. They found an aristocrat who paid their way to go and do something. They were riding on the coattails of the wealthy. But you know what? They also kind of did the same thing. All right, of I'm going to do what I want, and you're going to pay my way for it, and you're going to like it.
So you mean patronize, not like look down upon.
Correct.
Patronize
Well,
enter a relationship between a patron and a client.
It's actually both, but yes, the patron and a client is the financial relationship of a minstrel. But yeah, minstrels didn't have. They were just a half a rung above the youngsters.
That's where that term is derived from.
To be a patron, right? Yeah. To be a patron or a benefactor, right? Had to bring out my Charles Dickens there. Okay. Vagrants, they were really seen as morally suspect. Again, like they were the pickpockets, right? You were, okay, I think we get it. Okay. However, young minstrels could take orders, they could become clergymen, and then they were priests. Remember, they were priests first and then musicians later, right? So they were converts. What grace? What grace? Think about that for just a second. We have these people that are looked so far down upon that you see them coming and you're going to hold your purse a little tighter. You see them coming and you're going to put your hand in your pocket because you don't know if you're going to have your wallet when they walk by. And yet the church is taking them in, teaching them Christianity, and converting them to the faith where they can stay and study. One such of these is Guido de Arezzo. He was a monk. We can attribute and credit him with the advent of what we call today music theory. What we see in our songbooks today is because of him. And it's not that far different. Okay. A bunch of these other sources that are here. These are primary sources that discuss some of these things. High medieval time, we now have universities in play all throughout Europe, monasteries all throughout Europe. They included music as part of the quadrivium, which brought legitimacy to music. We have troubadours in the south of France, trouvères in the northern part of France. These were oftentimes nobles themselves, but they were tied to nobility. These were like your what we would call maybe like your rich playboys running around all of France, playing from noble to noble. Alrighty, little more respectable because of their position, because they may have been landowners, but that's about it. Okay. Instruments entered religious ceremonies during this time, but only through processions and festivals, not actually in worship. Royalty and clergy was starting to intertwine. We see a little bit of overlapping occurring here. It's not until this period here, the late medieval, where we actually see salaried musicians. We're almost to the Renaissance, okay? We're 1,300 years after Christ, and we're just now starting to see this, okay? That third bullet point, secular court musicians, notably in Italy, although in some other places also, they were working cathedrals, they were on the payroll. William Dufay, probably one of the most famous in all of medieval history. He was employed by multiple courts. This guy figured it out. He was one of the wealthiest musicians we have. Okay, here's your summary slide for the week. Musicians were everywhere. in religion, in politics. Outside of those two spheres, musicians had very little wealth, or very little social standing. Very little, okay? Early Christianity rejected instruments, as is written, likely because they were associated with pagan worship. That's the takeaway from this particular week. Isolated that only to this week. Alrighty, that's a really important thing that is within this context. It's like Philippians 4:13. You have to take it this context. Then during the medieval time period, we gain legitimacy through the role that they play. This was the unit overall. This is what you should have gotten out of the last 3 weeks. Archaeological record establishes that the instrumental music thrived through the ancient world, providing access to education, religious practice, secular events, and despite that access to instrumental music, primary source secular and religious texts are very clear that musical instruments were not adopted in Christian worship for at least the first 700 years, likely the first 1100. Could be more. The social status of instrumental musicians existed within royal and pagan religious settings, but did not transfer into Christianity for at least the first 1,000 years after Christ. So what? For over 1,000 years after Christ, Christian worship began and remained a cappella, culturally, theologically, and socially. It's a powerful statement. But you just spent 3 hours of your life learning why over the last 3 weeks. Right? It's a big, big deal. Okay, that's the end of Unit 1. Next week, we start Unit 2, which is instrumental music from a scriptural perspective. Next week, we're going to talk about actual Scripture. We're going to dive deep into what Scripture actually says, specifically the New Testament. Week 5, we're going to get into what the world Christianity says about their take on Scripture. We're going to look at what the founders of various denominations said about instrumental music, and we're going to look at when instrumental music entered into these denominations and why. And then in week 6, we're going to look at all of these justifications from these denominations and more. I have 30 of them. Of justifications for musical instruments, and we're going to look at each one of them, and we're going to find out, do any of these hold water or not? That's Unit 2, weeks 4, 5, and 6. Okay? 7, 8, 9 is all about physical health. Why would God even want us to sing? Physical health, spiritual health, mental health, all of those things. Okay? 10, 11, 12 is the doing. Why study if you don't have application? Okay? So that's the week that we're going to be there. Thank you for your attention. Have a great evening.